Your moral record is spotless. Like every bridge no truck has ever crossed. Nothing has yet asked more of your decency than you had. Philosophers call that gap moral luck, and the phrase is an accusation. It says the distance between you and a man you despise may be the tests you were each handed. Take back what you did not choose, and what holds your character up is an open question. You cannot check that from the inside. There is one morning on record where it can be checked, in a field in Poland in 1942. Part 1. You would never have done it. You are standing in a field outside a Polish village, and the date is the 13th of July, 1942. You are 39 years old, a reserve policeman from Hamburg, trucked here overnight. Your commanding officer has just said something extraordinary. If any of the older men do not feel up to the task ahead, they may step out. You know what the task is. Roughly 1,500 Jewish women, children, and elderly people are waiting in the village. So answer and notice how fast you answered. Do you step out? You have already said yes, and you have never once checked. Your yes is not stupid, and it rests on a principle you did not get from a book. Blame requires that the thing blamed be your fault. Where it is not your fault, blame is a mistake, and you already apply this without being taught. A woman in a crowd steps hard on your toes, and you turn to say something. Then you see that she was pushed. The anger does not soften. It stops having a target because nothing she did produced the pain in your foot. Nagel lists the standard ways this happens: involuntary movement, physical force, and ignorance of the circumstances. A clear absence of control, produced by any of those, excuses what was done from moral judgment. Vary one thing at a time, and the principle shows itself cleanly. 2 reserve policemen, the same record, the same opinions, the same nerve. One of them is on the truck to Józefów on the 12th of July. The other is left on garrison duty in Hamburg. Only the posting differed between them, and the posting was not theirs to choose. Written as a rule, it says this: we are morally assessable only to the extent that what we are assessed for depends on factors under our control. And it has a corollary that does the real work. 2 people should not be assessed differently if the only differences between them lie beyond their control. One thing plainly beyond anybody's control is which tests he gets handed. Nagel calls that luck in one's circumstances, the kind of problems and situations one faces. Nagel counts 4 kinds, and circumstance is only the second. The others are the character you were issued, the way your acts turn out, and the causes standing behind your will. Each will get its own field. Now run the 3 pieces together on the field. A man is blameworthy for the shooting only if the shooting was his fault. It was his fault only if it was, in some real measure, up to him. And it was up to him only if he could have done otherwise that morning without being destroyed for it. That needs a threshold, and here is the one this argument uses. A cost excuses only if it is comparable to the harm you are being asked to do. Losing a promotion is not comparable to shooting a child, so on this threshold the exit counts as real. Notice what that comparison treats as settled. It assumes a promotion costs every man the same thing. One of the men who stepped out of that field will say otherwise in his own words, before this part is over. So the men in that field are culpable exactly to the extent that refusal was genuinely available. Everything turns on that last clause, and it is a question about the world rather than about them. Which is where the case usually gets closed, and closed in the men's favour. It is the assumption defence counsel ran on at the trials, and popular accounts run on it still. Refuse an order in a killing unit in occupied Poland, and you are shot beside the victims. If that is right, the men had no exit, and the principle excuses them entirely. This defence says nothing about their characters at all. It says the room had one door, and the door was locked. It would also mean nothing whatever follows about you, since nobody has ever ordered you to do anything. On this one occasion we can check. Christopher Browning reconstructed that morning from the Hamburg State Prosecutor's files. 2 investigations running through the 1960s and into the early 70s interrogated no fewer than 210 former members of the battalion. These were Hamburg Reserve policemen, average age 39, over 60% of them of working-class background. About a quarter belonged to the Nazi Party in 1942, which means 3 in 4 did not. Their commander, Major Trapp, made the offer out loud to the assembled battalion and then paused. After some moments, one man stepped forward. The captain of 3rd Company, enraged that one of his men had broken ranks, began to berate him. The major told the captain to hold his tongue. Then 10 or 12 other men stepped forward as well, turned in their rifles, and were told to wait. By dusk, some 1,500 Jews lay dead, and the rest climbed into their trucks and drove back to Bilgoraj. So, what did the men who stepped out actually pay? Browning's verdict on that, drawn from the testimony of the men themselves, is one sentence. The consequences of their holding aloof from the mass murder were not grave. A reserve lieutenant in 1st Company who protested was afterwards left out of the loop. In November 1942 he was recalled to Hamburg, made adjutant to the police president of that city, and subsequently promoted. The exit was announced out loud, and the recorded cost of taking it was a police career that would not prosper. One man stepped forward, then 10 or 12 more. Everyone else heard the same offer, knew the same price, and stayed. These men were not conscripts, and they were not facing a gun. They were middle-aged Hamburg policemen with an offer on the table, and you are confident you would have taken it. So look at the men who did step out, because they are your evidence that passing was possible. One of them explained afterwards why he was able to do it. He said he was not a career policeman and did not want to become one. He was an independent, skilled craftsman, and he had his business back home. Thus, he said, it was of no consequence that his police career would not prosper. Read that again as an answer to why a man declines to shoot children. It is an account of what he could afford. That is a balance sheet, and it is what his own words preserve. Now the harder question, and it is about you rather than about them. What exactly is your confidence a claim about? It is not a claim about anything you have done. 210 men sat through those interrogations, and until the summer of 1942 every one of them had your record. No refusals because nothing had been asked. No collaboration because nobody had proposed any. A working life in Hamburg, a trade, a family, and a set of settled opinions about decency. Not one of them was a man who had failed a test of this kind before. There was no test before. Your record contains no moment comparable to that field, and neither did theirs until it did. There is a serious objection to the balance sheet, and it lands on the reading I have just given. Michelle Moody Adams calls it the inability thesis, and her charge against it comes later. Look at the premise the craftsman just handed me. He could afford to refuse, so the men who stayed could not afford to refuse. That runs from what they did not do to what they could not do. It is exactly the move she says has nothing behind it. Almost nobody stepped out, and behaviour like that is predicted better by the situation a man stands in than by anything about the man. And nothing in that fact shows that any particular man was unable to. So the men who stayed were tested with the door held open, and they failed. You would have passed. That is not a claim about anything you have done. It is a claim about a room you have never entered. What kind of fact is that, and is there anything in there to be right about? Part 2. Nobody ever knocked on your door. You answered before you finished reading the question. You would have stepped out. Notice what kind of claim that is. Nothing in your own record backs it. You are claiming to know what you would freely have done in a field in Poland in 1942. And counterfactuals about what people would freely do are notoriously hard to evaluate. There is no experiment you can run on yourself, but there is one population where somebody actually checked because that population left files. People who did refuse at enormous risk and whose cases were documented afterwards by an institution that had to decide whether to honour them. If character produces rescue, that is where it would show. Before the numbers, the shape of the thing. Nagel's own example of test you did not choose is a pair of men. One was an officer in a concentration camp. In Nagel's words, he might have led a quiet and harmless life if the Nazis had never come to power. The other led a quiet and harmless life in Argentina. He might have become an officer in a camp if he had not left Germany for business reasons in 1930. Hold that last clause. The man's company moved him. Nagel gives no details, so supply the ordinary ones. A posting, a salary attached to it, a wife who did not want to go. The decision had no moral content whatsoever, and it produced the entire moral difference between them. And notice what the emigrant's record actually contains. He was never offered anything, and never meeting a temptation is no achievement at all. Resisting one would have been. When you look at your own record and find nothing terrible in it, that is the emigrant's record you are reading. There is no entry in it where the price of decency was your livelihood. So here is the version of the test that was actually administered, and it did not come from a commanding officer. It came as a knock at the door. It is late, and someone you know slightly is standing outside, a woman from 2 streets over with a child who is not hers. She is asking you to keep them, not for an afternoon, for as long as it takes, in a flat with a landlord and neighbours who count the bread. You have perhaps 4 seconds, and there is no version of the next hour in which you have not answered. Before I give you what happened, work out what would count as an answer. Because people were not asked at random. In 1942, a person deciding whose door to knock on is making the most consequential judgment of character in their life. They are not drawing names. They are thinking about who has never repeated anything, and who was decent to them in 1938, and who said the wrong thing out loud at a dinner in 1939 and paid for it. Press that harder because the asker's own life is on the table. Hiding somebody places your family inside another household's discretion permanently with no way to withdraw. A person choosing under that pressure screens ruthlessly and knocks only where the evidence is already overwhelming. So, if the asking tracks reputation, being asked is the visible consequence of a character already built. Any number I am about to read you would then be a report on the quality of the filter, and nothing about anybody. Federico Varese and Mayor Yaish went back to the data from the Oliner's Altruistic Personality Project and reanalyzed it. 346 rescuers, 164 non-rescuers, and one question the original study never made central. Did somebody ask you? Of those 510 people, 247 remembered being asked. 237 of them helped. 96%. The paper puts the gap between the asked and the unasked at more than 17-1. That figure counts asked rescuers and asked non-rescuers together, which is the only thing that keeps it from being a tautology. Among the rescuers themselves, 2/3 were asked and only 1/3 went looking. Now the filter, because the paper went looking for it and found it in its own data. Those involved in resistance activities were more than twice as likely to be asked for help. Read honestly, that grants the objection its premise and blocks its conclusion. Character is not irrelevant. Something about a person raises the odds that the occasion finds them at all. But be exact about what that covers. It covers part of who got asked and none of the 96%. That figure is the helping rate among people who had already been asked, and almost none of them refused. The filter decided who got the question. It did not answer it. So the claim to carry forward is narrower than the slogan that situations swamp character. Character selects you into the occasion. The occasion produces the act. And the distribution of occasions is not yours. Know what kind of file this is before you lean on it. Interviews decades after the war, neither sample random 95% of the rescuers off Yad Vashem's list and the non-rescuers picked to match. And being asked is a man's own memory of 1942. Whatever the righteous had, it did not show up at the moment of decision. It showed up in whose door got knocked on. Set it out so you can check it. 1. Which moral tests you face is not up to you. 2. In occupied Europe, the test of rescue arrived as a request for 2/3 of those who passed it. 3. Among the people who received that request, refusal was rare enough to be a rounding error. And nothing you know about yourself tells you whether a request would ever have reached you. There is a sentence of Nagel's your confidence has to get past. We judge people for what they actually do or fail to do, not just for what they would have done if circumstances had been different. That cuts toward you rather than away from you. The rule protecting the untested man from blame also refuses him the credit. If he cannot be blamed for what he never did, he cannot be praised for it either. Praise would have to run on different rules from blame, and nobody has said why it would. You are asking to be assessed on a counterfactual, inside a practice that assesses conduct. There is a second question underneath, and it is not about evidence at all. When you say you would have refused, what is that a fact about? Michael Zimmerman's answer is that it is a fact about you all the same. If the emigrant would freely have collaborated, he is just as responsible as the man who did, in virtue of that fact. Responsible without being responsible for anything. But that answer needs the counterfactual to be true, and this is where the flaw gives way. Robert Adams raised the worry, Dana Nelkin pressed it, and Zimmerman conceded it. Large classes of counterfactuals about what somebody would freely have chosen may lack any truth value at all. That is not a complaint about our ignorance. The claim is that there is nothing there to be right about. Your confidence may not be false. It may be empty. So ask what is left for a person to be assessed on. Dana Nelkin concedes that which opportunities you face really is luck, then rebuilds the wall one step back. Once you can genuinely do the right thing and know that you can, you are assessed only on what you do with it. And that is the repair you have been reaching for since the field. The emigrant and the camp officer differ in outcome and in nothing else. The asked and the unasked differ in occasion and in nothing else. In both pairs, the thing you kept reaching for was the willing. So judge people by that, not by what happened to them, but by what was actually up to them. It is the generous principle, and it is the one you would want applied to you. Does it work? Part 3. Judge me by what I meant. So you make the repair, and it is the right repair to reach for. If whether anybody ever asked you was not up to you, then stop scoring what happened. Score what the person meant. That is the control principle again, and it is what you already mean when you say something was not somebody's fault. Kant gave this ambition its most quoted sentence in 1785. A good will, he wrote, is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes, but only because of its volition. Then the line everybody remembers. Even if by a special disfavour of fortune this will should wholly lack the capacity to carry out its purpose, then, like a jewel, it would still shine by itself, as something that has its full worth in itself. Usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add anything to this worth nor take anything away from it. The popular version drops a qualifier sitting inside the passage. A good will summons all the means that are in our control, and a mere wish never qualifies. The argument the debate ascribes to him runs in 4 steps. Moral assessment is assessment of the will. What the will does is not conditioned by empirical circumstance. Ought implies can, so no obligation can depend on what you do not control. Therefore, consequences, temperament and circumstance cannot add anything to moral worth or take anything away. And then a conclusion that is not a technicality. If worth lies there, it is equally available to every rational being, whatever else they were handed. Whether Kant himself held the pure version is disputed, and he plainly imputes consequences. Lie to the murderer at your door and say the man he wants has gone out. If the murderer meets him outside and kills him, Kant says you can be prosecuted as the initiator of that death. But Kant is not the version you live by. The version you live by is older, and it is currently sold as self-help. The dichotomy of control is the line printed on the first page of the popular Stoicism books and taught as the whole of the practice. What those books quietly drop is the part where health, your relationships, and being tortured to death are all indifferent. Epictetus divides the world in two: what is up to us and what is not. Up to us are convictions, attitudes, intentions and choices. Not up to us are the body, possessions, reputation and other people. The good, he says, consists in a certain disposition of one's volition. The materials of action are indifferent, but the use we make of them is not indifferent. And the mechanism has a name: assent. An impression arrives, and reason decides whether to sign for it. Sit in a dentist's chair with no anaesthetic. The impression of pain arrives. You decline to assent to it, and you sit unflinching. Nothing about the drill has changed. What changed is what you did with the report the drill sent up. On the Stoic account, every situation in your life is that chair. Marcus Aurelius calls the part of you that decides the inner citadel, and a citadel cannot be stormed from outside. There are no tragic forks on the virtuous path, because virtue is one thing and cannot make conflicting demands on you. It is also not neutral. Bundled into it is the claim that health, possessions, your relationships, and being tortured to death are all indifferent. They have value in the Stoic vocabulary. They are not good. Mathieu Queloz and Marcel van Ackeren draw the structural conclusion. The ambition to shelter one kind of value from luck is multiply realizable, and its most vivid realization is Stoic rather than Kantian, which is why the virtue ethics revival can rebuild the exact thing it thought it was fleeing. Williams spent a career attacking this ideal, and still granted its appeal in one sentence. Such a conception has an ultimate form of justice at its heart, and that is its allure. Talent and upbringing are handed out unfairly, and everybody knows it. Here is one good that fortune cannot allocate, open not to the talents, but to a capacity every rational being holds in the same degree. The one fair thing in human life. Now watch what the repair costs. Strip out the results, and luck moves inward, and each thing you strip out leaves something further in that you also did not choose. Nagel has a name for where that subtraction ends. He calls it the extensionless point. Williams is not asking Nagel's question. He asks whether moral value can be both immune to luck and supreme. His answer is that it cannot be both, and he does not want the ideal repaired. He wants it given up. He coined the phrase moral luck, expecting it to sound like a contradiction in terms. His test case is a painter he calls Gauguin, invented rather than historical. The man is inside morality, not outside it. He sees exactly what leaving his family costs, finds it grim, and goes anyway. No justification is available to him at the moment of choosing. If his talent turns out to be real, he has a basis for thinking he was justified. If it does not, he does not. The justification, in Williams's phrase, is essentially retrospective. And notice what the case denies. The citadel needed virtue to be one thing that never makes conflicting demands. Gauguin is virtue making two demands, with one of them losing. So ask what retrospective cashes out, as in the world, where a verdict has to be delivered by something. Gauguin's Nafea Faa Epoipo was reported everywhere as the $300 million painting. A London court corrected that price by 30% in a fight over a broker's commission, a century after he died. That was the number supposed to redeem the abandonment of a family. The hardest blow is the oldest, and it landed 217 years before anybody said moral luck. Adam Smith, 1759, has a section called "Of the Influence of Fortune upon the Sentiments of Mankind with regard to the merit or demerit of actions." He records your complaint in its full form. That the world judges by the event and not by the design has been in all ages the complaint, and is the great discouragement of virtue. Smith agrees with you about desert. Merit and demerit belong to the intention and the affection of the heart. Then he defends the outcome-sensitive practice anyway, on grounds that have nothing to do with desert. Sentiments, designs, and affections, he writes, are placed by the great judge of hearts beyond the limits of every human jurisdiction. Only actions that produce evil, or attempt to, and put us in immediate fear of it, are proper objects of human punishment. Because while bad intentions were as much resented as bad actions, they would equally expose the person to punishment, and every court of judicature would become a real inquisition. That is what the dentist's chair costs the moment it stops being a private discipline and becomes a jurisdiction. Somebody has to get inside the citadel and read what you assented to. You can accept all of that and say morality is not a court. Keep the ideal as a private standard and let the law do something coarser. Then run the private version to the end, with no court anywhere in it. And the purest luck-proof ethics in the canon is not Kant's. It is Peter Abelard's 6 centuries earlier. Abelard puts the whole of sin in consent. The moment the will agrees to what it knows, it should refuse. The desire adds nothing to that, and the completed deed adds nothing either. A man who consents to a killing and is seized before he can strike carries the guilt of the man who struck. In themselves, deeds are morally indifferent. That is the Stoic's word for the outside world, reached from Christian premises with no Stoic in sight. He follows that where it goes. The men who crucified Christ acted on beliefs that were false and not negligently held, so the deed does not make them evil. And he argues that they would have sinned had they thought crucifying Christ was required and then refused. A morality that judges only the inner will needs a judge who can read hearts. No human court can, and the courts that tried are the ones we named inquisitions. And the purest version anyone actually wrote down ends in the claim that Christ's killers would have sinned by refusing to kill him. But perhaps it does not have to go that far. Perhaps one step is enough. Leave character alone, leave circumstance alone, and strip out only the results. Say that two people whose recklessness is identical are exactly as culpable as each other, whatever the world then did with it. It looks like the cheap fix that keeps everything worth keeping. So why is the line drawn precisely there? Part 4. The Bird and the Bullet. You do not have to build the Inquisition to keep your innocence. There is a cheaper repair available, and almost the whole field has taken it. Keep the will as the thing that gets judged, and refuse only one kind of luck. Refuse the luck that arrives after you have already acted. Deny resultant luck and keep the other 3. Hartmann calls it the asymmetry view, and counts the published opinions to show it is the majority. It is almost certainly also yours. So take the case built, to test exactly that. Two people with everything mental held fixed by stipulation. Same grudge, same weeks of deliberation, same rifle, same distance, same squeeze of the same trigger. A bird crosses the path of one bullet. One of them is a murderer. The other is a man who tried. Here are Nagel's own words for what culpability appears to turn on. Whether the victim happened to be wearing a bulletproof vest or whether a bird flew into the path of the bullet. Nagel offered that as a reductio. There is no moral content anywhere in the bird. It was going somewhere for reasons of its own. Nagel's other example is the one everybody quotes and almost everybody tells wrong. Nagel's driver is one man, described twice. Verbatim. Someone has had too much to drink and his car swerves onto the sidewalk. He can count himself morally lucky if there are no pedestrians in its path. And if he hurts no one, although his recklessness is exactly the same, he is guilty of a far less serious legal offence. One driver, two possible worlds, and the same alcohol in both. So the deniers have two routes worth your time, and neither one appeals to fairness. Start with what you actually do. You judge the shooter who hit more harshly than the shooter the bird stopped, and that judgment does not feel like an error. The first route explains the feeling without licensing it. An outcome is evidence about the will behind it, never a part of what makes that will bad. Hitting is fallible evidence of a firmer grip on the intention, so judging the two shooters differently is rational. The mistake sits only in the last step, where a warranted judgment is turned into a different desert. The second is Talbert's, published in 2024. Stand over the body on the pavement and ask what part of it is the wrong. The regard the shooter owed that man was already withheld weeks earlier in the planning. The corpse arrives after a failure of regard that was complete before the trigger moved. Talbert's account is that blameworthiness is being a fitting target of the morally offended attitudes, resentment above all. What makes those attitudes fitting is a failure to show another person due moral regard. A body is not itself such a failure, and neither is being its cause. So the corpse makes the shooter's motives more salient without making them any worse. On Talbert's account, it changes our readiness to blame, and not his blameworthiness. You have kept 3 kinds of luck and thrown one out. Hartman's question is why there. He hires 3 assassins. Each one plans, each one shows up, each has a single chance at the trigger. Sneezy's allergies flare at the moment. A sneezing fit takes her, and she never fires. Off-target has the same allergies, they stay quiet, she fires, and a bird intercepts the bullet. Bullseye fires, and the mark dies where he stands. You have already granted circumstantial luck, so you are committed to Sneezy being less blameworthy than off-target. Her nose decided whether she got the opportunity at all. Now hold the 2 gaps side by side, Sneezy to off-target, then off-target to bullseye. Nyman lays the argument out in steps you can check. 1. Circumstantial luck affects blameworthiness, which you have already granted. 2. Both gaps share the features that made the first gap matter. Each pair has identical agency, meaning both women exercise the same capacities to the same degree. Each pair has near identical mental states, and in each pair the worse event is brought about voluntarily. Call step 2 the parity premise. It is the premise your position has to break. If the first gap is real and the pairs are alike in those ways, then resultant luck is real in the second. You can break that premise. Off-target and bullseye are separated by luck and by nothing else, while sneezy and off-target are separated by luck only in part. Getting the chance to fire is luck. Pulling the trigger once you have it is not. So the ladder does not carry you down to the bird, but look at what breaking it leaves you holding. You have a reason the second gap is unlike the first, and no reason at all why results in particular cannot count. Rivera Lopez and Demirtas have both tried to supply one, and each ends up assuming the very line he set out to justify. You stopped at results because results are the one kind of luck whose unfairness you can see. And there is a premise in this debate that almost nobody says out loud. Every case so far has been about the unlucky one. Nobody checks the man who got away with it. Dillon and Tinsley checked in 2008, and their participants included NASA employees and contractors. People rated managers whose decisions produced near misses as highly as managers whose decisions had actually succeeded. These are professionals whose working lives are organized around what nearly went wrong. They scored the escape as competence. Then the other half of the finding, which is the half about you. People who had been shown the near miss went on to choose the riskier option next time. Nothing had changed in the odds of failure. What changed was how dangerous those odds looked from the inside. The escape read as evidence that the risk had been smaller than they thought. So the damage good luck does is not only to the people watching who let you off. It reaches the one place you were sure luck could not touch, which is what you believe you learned. The morning nothing happened is the morning you were taught the wrong lesson, and you will spend it on the next junction. You have had one of these mornings. The junction you entered about half a second before you had finished looking, and the horn from your right. You did not file it under recklessness because there was nothing to file. You filed it as the morning you got to the meeting. Every argument here says your recklessness that morning was exactly what it would have been if that car had been 3 feet closer. The horn was the only difference, and the horn came from outside you. Nobody in this literature tells you how thin that line is. The Centers for Disease Control measured it. For 2012, the agency put alcohol-impaired driving episodes by American adults at roughly 121 million for the year. For 2013, it counted 10,076 deaths in crashes where a driver was at or above the legal limit. The years do not match, and the division that follows is mine and not theirs. Roughly 121 million drunk drives and about 10,000 deaths. The sorting between the monster and the man who got home safe is done by whether a child steps off a curb. Suppose the deniers are right. Then blameworthiness is fixed at the instant the trigger moves. Now look at the machinery we have actually built. Sentencing and tort both run on outcomes. The malpractice claim arrives when the patient dies, and never when the same careless reading harms nobody. So, if outcomes add nothing, both of them are systematically unjust. Are they? Part 5. The lottery you were sentenced to. You filed your own near miss as a success and never audited it. A criminal court runs the same arithmetic in public, and it has to write down a number. Hart put the question in one sentence. Why, he asked, should the accidental fact that an intended harmful outcome has not occurred be a ground for punishing less? The criminal in question may be equally dangerous and equally wicked. That question gets answered in writing, in sentencing statutes, twice and in opposite directions. California's attempt statute gives the answer most legal systems give. The attempter is punished for 1/2 the term prescribed for the offence he attempted. The Model Penal Code gives the opposite answer. Attempt is a crime of the same grade and degree as the offence attempted, so the miss cost you what the hit cost you. Then the drafters carved out capital crimes and first-degree felonies, and dropped those attempts by a degree. The exception covers murder, which is where the disagreement actually bites. One legal culture, two instincts, and they collide at the top. David Lewis built the cleanest version of this in 1989, and then built something much worse out of it. D takes a shot at his enemy. So does Dumb. D hits and Dumb misses, and that is the only difference between them. Keep the premises where you can see them. They wanted the same thing equally, so desert cannot separate them. They impose the same risk on the same kind of victim, so danger cannot separate them. Dumb needs locking up exactly as much as D does, so incapacitation cannot separate them. And deterrence cannot either. You cannot deter success separately from deterring attempts, because attempters make no separate choice about whether to succeed. There is no second decision for the extra threat to reach. Lewis then went through the answers that remain and killed them one at a time. Punishing the killer harder to satisfy the victim's family explains our practice and does nothing to defend it as just. Leaving settled expectations undisturbed is a reason of prudence, not of justice. The fear that a man with nothing left to lose will try again is answered by punishing 2 attempts more than 1. We could do that, whether or not either attempt worked. And the answer you have already met, that hitting is evidence of a wholehearted attempt he grants and then refuses to use. It is just, he says, to punish a man in proportion to how wholeheartedly he tried. It is not just to punish success as a rough and ready way of getting at that. His phrase, "It is just too rough and ready." Age might predict wholeheartedness more reliably than success does, and sentencing by age would still fall far short of justice. Then he builds a ladder of 6 cases, and each rung differs from the one before it only in administrative convenience. First, on the gallows steps, the convicted man draws straws, with the odds matched to the risk he imposed. Impose an 80% chance of death, and you draw from 8 short straws and 2 long ones. Second, the draw happens in secret before the trial, held by a public official. Third, the same draw announced in advance. Fourth, make it impure, so that losers die and winners get a short prison term. That way the trial still bites for a man who has already won. Fifth, throw out the straws and stage an exact reenactment of the crime, and he loses if the stand-in victim dies. Sixth, throw out the reenactment and use the original crime, which is its own perfect reenactment. Lewis prefers that last rung because matching odds by straws would force a court to measure the risk, and the crime measures it automatically. 2 rungs look like places the ladder might genuinely break. At the second rung, the secrecy takes away the condemned man's knowledge that he is being gambled with. Between the 5th and the 6th, who bears the staked risk changes, from a live stand-in to a victim already dead. Lewis's challenge is that neither difference looks like the kind that turns a monstrous practice into an ordinary one. Notice what the chance device has become by the sixth rung. The bird that crossed the path of the bullet is not interference with the system. It is the randomizer working as designed. Our present practice is case 6. We already run a penal lottery. The only thing we have disguised is the draw, because the victim's death is doing 2 jobs at once. It is the harm, and it is the losing ticket. You may want to say that no serious legal system would gamble with a man's life like that. In 1972, 5 justices of the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty because it did. Justice Stewart, concurring in Furman against Georgia, wrote this: "These death sentences are cruel and unusual in the same way that being struck by lightning is cruel and unusual. Of all the people convicted of rapes and murders in 1967 and 1968, many just as reprehensible, the petitioners are a capriciously selected, random handful." What Stewart objected to was the selection. Nothing rational separated the men who got it from the men who did not. Which leaves the question of what an institution does once somebody puts a number on the arbitrariness. 15 years after Furman, on the 22nd of April 1987, the Supreme Court had a measurement in front of it. One of the Boulder Studies models had taken account of 39 non-racial variables. It found that defendants charged with killing white victims were 4.3 times as likely to receive a death sentence. The comparison was with defendants charged with killing black victims. The majority did not dispute the number. By 5 votes to 4, it declined relief and stated its reason. McCleskey's claim, taken to its logical conclusion, throws into serious question the principles that underlie our entire criminal justice system. A factor wholly outside the defendant's control multiplied his exposure to execution, and the remedy was refused because it would not stay put. 3 objections. Start with Lewis, who did not believe his own reconstruction. His verdict on the practice he had just explained: most likely it is not just, but he does not understand why not. He is telling you that if case 1 is monstrous and case 6 is ordinary, you owe an account of which rung did the moral work. Second, the same legal system carries the opposite instinct, and that instinct has a price tag. On the 20th of February 1889, in a Wisconsin schoolroom, class had just been called to order. An 11-year-old named George Putney lightly kicked the boy across the aisle. Andrew Vosberg was 14, and that leg had already been injured by an axe 2 years earlier. Infection followed, then 2 operations, then permanent weakness. The jury found that Putney never intended to cause any harm and awarded $2,500. Set that against the attempt discount. The general attempt rule halves your punishment when your victim happens to survive. Tort charges you in full for a consequence nobody could have foreseen, from a kick that should have been nothing at all. That is the doctrine. Now watch the machinery run. Harvard researchers had already sent clinical reviewers through a large set of hospital injuries, marking which ones involved genuine negligence. Then they followed the injuries that turned into malpractice suits and read the outcomes. 51 claims, 46 of them closed by the end of 1995. In their analysis, one thing predicted whether money was paid, and it was whether the patient was left permanently disabled. Whether a doctor had actually been negligent predicted nothing. The average payment on injuries with no negligence in them came out higher than the average on negligent ones. 46 claims is a small number, and it is one state 30 years ago. A review of about 1,500 closed claims a decade later found the system sorting far better. There, most claims without error paid nothing, and most claims with error paid. So keep the claim narrow, and it still stands. In the one cohort where somebody graded the negligence first and then watched the courts sorted by how badly the patient ended up. And notice who never appears in that data set. The doctor who read the scan just as carelessly and got lucky is not in the file, because nobody sued him and no board reviewed him. Third, a court is never asked what you are worth. It is asked what may now be done to you, and those are not obviously the same question. Mitchell-Berman pulls the two apart. Blameworthiness lifts a bar and licenses treatment of you that would otherwise be forbidden. Desert is the further and larger claim that such treatment is positively owed to you. A judge who jails the man whose victim died has answered the first question. He has never been asked the second. On that split, results can change what may be done to you without changing how blameworthy you are. Himmer turns the knife the other way. Suppose you care about whether punishment tracks what a person actually deserves. Then resultant luck is a red herring. His reason is precise. The consequences of an act come after the act, so they play no part in conditioning whether it is performed. Constitutive luck and circumstantial luck come before it and shape whether it happens at all. He thinks luck does sink desert-based punishment, only not this luck. Price that concession before you accept it. The two kinds he leaves standing are the ones no courtroom can reach. Nobody chose his own temperament, and nobody chose which situation came to meet it. Himmer holds that those two sink desert-based punishment altogether. So the sentencing judge does not walk away clean here. The trouble starts earlier than her verdict, and it is waiting in the parts of this argument still ahead. Grant every one of those objections. Grant that institutions can be forgiven their outcome sensitivity on grounds that have nothing to do with desert. Courts need cheap procedures, and compensation answers to the person injured rather than to the person who injured him. None of that touches the man, and the man is what you came here for. Somebody is standing at a curb who did nothing wrong whatsoever. A child is dead beneath his front wheels. No court will touch him. Nobody thinks one should. What is he supposed to feel, and is he right to feel it? Part 6. The feeling that won't follow the argument. The law holds both instincts because we do. So leave the statutes and go down to the feeling the statutes are trying to price. The lorry driver at the curb did nothing wrong. His speed was legal, his brakes were sound, his eyes were where they should be. A child ran out from between parked cars, and there was nothing he could do. Ask anyone whether he did wrong, and they will say no. Then ask what you would think if he shrugged. If he went to lunch and mentioned it that evening as a bad afternoon on the road. Something would be wrong with him. Ordinary moral language keeps 2 slots for feeling bad about a bad outcome. Neither one fits him. There is mere regret, and anybody can have it. A stranger reading about the accident can regret that the child died, and nothing in that regret is his own. Then there is remorse, which only the agent can feel, and which builds fault into itself. To feel remorse is to accept that you were culpable, and with it a need to make amends. The driver's feeling is first personal, like remorse, and fault-free, like regret. So either the feeling is a confusion, or 2 slots were never enough. Bernard Williams named the third thing in 1976 and called it agent regret. Its content is first personal in a way a bystander's regret cannot be. Things would have been better had I acted otherwise. Its proper object is the unintended consequence of something you did intentionally. And it carries a third feature that most discussions of it quietly drop. The driver wants to make amends himself, not to have amends made. Williams's test for that is that no insurance payout discharges it, because a common fund pays in nobody's name. A statement from your department chair cannot satisfy your need to apologize to a student you insulted. Williams then pushed the claim past psychology. Whether the unmoved driver is statistically unusual does not matter to him. A theory of rationality that rules the feeling out has, by that ruling, refuted itself. It would be a kind of insanity never to experience sentiments of this kind towards anyone. And it would be an insane concept of rationality which insisted that a rational person never would. His reason is that such a conception smuggles in a large falsehood. The falsehood is that we could detach ourselves entirely from the unintentional aspects of our actions and still be the same agents afterwards. Now the structure that makes this a puzzle rather than a mood. The driver should blame himself. We should not resent him, and we should try to talk him down. David Sussman calls that combination paradoxical, and he is right too. Everyone consoling the driver holds exactly the same beliefs about the accident that the driver holds. Susan Wolfe asks it from the other side. How can it be right for him to feel worse about himself, and wrong for us to feel worse toward him? Wolfe's version leaves the fault in on purpose. Both of her drivers are slightly negligent in the same way, neither having had his brakes inspected as recently as he ought to have. Each added the same 10% to the risk of a failure. One of them kills a child, the other gets home. The first has nightmares, cannot make himself drive, and feels he has to do something for the family. The second has the brakes fixed, takes the lesson, and sleeps. He feels no pull toward anyone, because there is nobody to feel it toward. If blame tracks fault, and only fault, one of these two men is feeling wrongly. Wolfe takes the options in turn. Say both should react like the first, and the second driver owes nightmares to a family that does not exist. Say both should react like the second, and the first man's shrug over a dead child is appalling. Say both belong somewhere in between, and no principle tells you where. The obvious escape is that the first driver did something worse since he ran over a child. Wolfe calls that a linguistic trick. Describing his act by its outcome asserts that outcomes count. It does not show that they do, and she has a case where the language runs out. A woman's affair is discovered and her lover's wife kills herself. A second woman has the identical affair and is never found out. No English sentence lets you say the first woman killed her. The extra self-blame still looks like the right response. Wolfe's own answer keeps the feeling and refuses the verdict, and a broken vase is the cheapest way to see it. Somebody knocks a vase off a side table. A guest who watched it fall offers to buy a replacement, and that is a generous offer. The man who knocked it over offers to buy a replacement. Same object, same money, same generosity. Only the second offer is expected, and only its absence would disturb you. Nothing in that difference is a claim about who deserves to pay. The two men have been handed different occasions, and an occasion is not a verdict. So go back to the man from the first minute, the one who shrugged and was right to think he was blameless. By stipulation, his arithmetic is exact. What is wrong with the driver who correctly calculates that he is not to blame is not his arithmetic. It is that he draws a circle around himself, coincident with the sphere of his will. The virtue that man is missing has no name, which Woolf treats as a fact about our vocabulary. It is a willingness to be held accountable for what you do. It takes the scope of what you do expansively rather than narrowly, and especially where costs are involved. She grounds it twice. It is a relative of generosity, which gives more than justice requires, so nobody can be owed it. And it is a condition of psychic health. A man who takes responsibility only for what his will controlled cannot be a friend, a parent, or a colleague. Every one of those relations involves answering for effects you did not intend. Think of the colleague who never apologizes for anything he did not mean to do. She also fixes a limit that her admirers forget. Taking on more responsibility for harms further from your control does not make you better. Now the strongest objection, and it does not call the driver silly. Sussman's first move is a deflation he does not finally accept. It is the argument a denier should actually run, and it concedes the feeling before taking it away. Begin with the standards. Due care is vague, and whether you met it on a particular afternoon is genuinely hard to establish. Now add a fact about the judge. Nobody is a reliable assessor of his own case, and you are known to be biased in your own favour. So, an hour after a child has died under your wheels, your belief that you were faultless is not one you can trust. Then price the two mistakes. Failing to apologize when you were guilty is an injustice. Apologizing when you were innocent is, at worst, a kindness. The rational posture is the penitence, held until better-placed judges absolve you. On that reading, agent regret collapses back into remorse, held under uncertainty about your own fault. The driver's thought becomes this: I cannot see how I was at fault, and I take seriously that I might be wrong. On that reading, the feeling should fade as evidence accumulates and the passions cool. That is what Williams himself reports. He never asked for permanent agent regret. He asked the driver to start there and work through it, and counted the resolution into ordinary regret as progress. So find the case where fault is not uncertain but closed, and closed by physics. A train cannot swerve, and it cannot stop in the distance available. Around 90 London Underground drivers a year have somebody jump or fall in front of the train. Tranner and Farmer interviewed 76 of them. At 1 month, 13 drivers, about 17%, met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them had recovered by the 6-month interview. The decay is no help to Sussman here. On his account, the feeling starts as a live doubt about fault. These men had no doubt to start from. The physics closed the question before they arrived. They feel it anyway. One limit belongs out loud. Trauma criteria establish that the feeling is severe and persistent, not what it is directed at. Everything downstream depends on one inference, so put it in the open. Fitting attitudes are usually assessed the way beliefs are. Fear is fitting when the thing is dangerous, and pride is fitting when the achievement is yours. On that model, a fitting self-blame requires something to blame yourself for. First premise: the driver's agent regret is fitting. Second premise: if an attitude of self-blame is fitting, then what it says is true. Conclusion: the driver is to some degree blameworthy. Williams presses the first premise and treats your resistance to it as a defect in your theory of rationality. Woolf grants the first and blocks the second by separating occasion from desert. Sussman grants the first and blocks the second somewhere else, which is why he ends up away from uncertainty about fault. Luck alone, he argues, made the driver and the child's family enemies blamelessly and briefly. When it ends, the parties need to mark that ordinary moral life between them has resumed. We have no ritual for that, so we borrow the rituals of apology and forgiveness. The parent saying there is nothing to forgive is the other half of the ritual, not proof it was hollow. His model is the restaurant check. You reach for it knowing it will be refused, and knowing that it should be refused. The reaching is not theatre. The datum survives every round of this argument, and the inference from it does not. Grant all of it. The circle is drawn too small, and enlarging it is a virtue rather than a confusion. Then look at what the argument has been assuming since its first sentence. It assumes that whatever sits inside the circle is yours. Your nerve, your capacity for sympathy. How much you mind other people being happier than you. Nobody in this part has earned that. Part 7. The part of you that was handed over. You have just agreed that the circle around a person can be drawn too small. Now watch what we do with what is already inside it. Nobody chose any of those qualities, and we condemn people for all of them anyway, without thinking an apology is owed. Nagel's catalogue is the plainest statement of the practice. A person may be greedy, envious, cowardly, cold, ungenerous, unkind, vain or conceited, and behave perfectly by a monumental effort of will. The envious man can congratulate his rival cordially and do nothing at all to spoil his success. He is still condemned as envious. Nagel's summary of what happens in that judgment is a single short sentence. People are assessed for what they are like. Your first reply is the right one to make, and almost everyone makes it. We are not blaming the envy itself. We are blaming the years in which he could have worked on it and did not. Blame the negligence, and the control principle survives untouched. George Scher's answer is empirical rather than clever. Many bad traits are in place before a person is old enough to be held responsible for his own moral education. And the obvious rejoinder that plenty of traits harden at 15 runs into a regress. Whatever you would have needed at 15 to work on the trait was itself already there. Attention to yourself, discomfort at what you found, willingness to be corrected. None of that was built at 15 either. So tracing either stops at an age where nobody is responsible, or it hands the job to another capacity you were issued. The honest residue is that partial tracing can shrink the trait's share of the blame without removing it, which is why Scher pressures the control principle rather than refuting it. The argument is short enough to lay out, and every step is one you already hold. First, the principle you accepted in the field, no assessment without control. Second, character is produced by genes and by the people who happened to be around you while it was forming. Third, none of those was under your control, and the earliest of them operated before there was anyone there to control anything. Fourth, so your character is not under your control. Fifth, so you are not assessable for it. But sixth, we assess persons constantly, and we do not withdraw the assessment once the argument is over. Nagel concedes the strength of this himself. We may become convinced that these assessments are illegitimate, and they return the moment we stop arguing. Ordinary moral life is very largely made of them. Seventh, actions flow from character, so if the fifth step holds, the assessment of actions goes with it. Which leaves two doors. Either the control principle is false, or an enormous tract of ordinary moral judgment is illegitimate. Robert Adams walks that argument backwards. He starts from the judgments nobody actually gives up, and throws out the principle instead. His paper is called Involuntary Sins, and it opens on anger. An anger not justified by a proportionate provocation is morally offensive, and one guilty of it is liable to blame. Anger is not in general voluntary. We may be very angry when we are trying hard not to be. The obvious reply is that we blame the shouting and not the fury. So Adams builds a case with no shouting anywhere in it. Two friends have wronged each other about equally. One offended grossly in things he chose to do. The other's conduct is almost impeccable. He does his duty, he is scrupulous, he is the one you would call reliable. His offence is that he is self-righteous. He wants to be above the other person, to be in the right against the other person. He thinks he would like the other to be a better person. He would hate to lose his position of being in the right. Now try to convert that into a choice. You cannot say he consented to the bad motive by acting on it. We do not think he ought to have chosen to leave his duty undone. Every voluntary act in the case was correct. The offence is what he was while performing them. Adams does not leave blame floating free of every condition. He replaces control with a condition about data. You are directly responsible for states of mind that have an object on one condition. You form them in response to data rich enough to permit a fairly adequate ethical appreciation of that object. The limits fall straight out of that. Pneumonia, blindness, a broken arm, and the absence of musical talent cannot be sins, because they are not states of mind. Hunger and thirst cannot either, because they have no object, and neither can much of the mental life of a small child. And the criterion cannot be applied without considerable exercise of moral judgment, which Adams says out loud. The hard case is where Adams parts from Alan Donegan. Donegan's rule is that ignorance is culpable if and only if it springs from negligence, from want of due care. A graduate of Sandhurst or West Point who does not understand his duty to non-combatants as human beings is certainly culpable for his ignorance. An officer bred up from childhood in the Hitler Jugend might not be. Adams refuses this flatly. The beliefs are heinous, and it is reprehensible to hold them even with no opportunity to act on them. No matter how he came by them, his evil beliefs are a part of who he is, morally, and make him a fitting object of reproach. He may also be a victim of his education. If he is, that gives him a particular claim to mercy. Mercy is available to him. Exemption is not. Adams also denies him the escape through ignorance on grounds that are almost brutally thin. The data were rich enough because it is enough to know that they are human. Adams and Donegan disagree about a case neither can settle by argument. But the disagreement makes an empirical prediction about whether people who actually assign blame treat a causal story as an excuse. Two pieces of work bear on it. The first asks people who pass sentence for a living. Aspinwall, Brown and Tarbury gave 181 United States state trial judges a hypothetical defendant diagnosed as a psychopath. Where expert testimony supplied a biomechanical cause, sentences fell from 13.93 years to 12.83. The proportion of judges listing mitigating factors rose from 29.7 to 47.8%. So, explaining where the character came from bought that defendant about 1 year, and 86.7% of the judges still listed aggravating factors too. The second finding closes the exit everyone reaches for, which is to move the credit onto upbringing. Moffat, Caspi and colleagues followed about 500 pairs of non-identical British twins. Within each pair, one sibling had scored lower on self-control at age 5. That sibling was the more likely of the two to begin smoking, to do badly at school, and to behave antisocially at 12. Same parents, same house, same family life. Self-control matters by itself, apart from everything siblings share. Their own headline points away from fatalism. Self-control is malleable, and the children whose self-control improved fared better than predicted. The level each child started improving from was already fixed at 5. There is no polygenic score for cowardice, and the argument does not need one. It needs only that the allocation at conception was unchosen. Everything so far has been fought uphill. Adams and the measurements are pushing against a principle assumed to belong to ordinary moral sense. Hume asked where that principle came from before Kant had finished formulating it. There is a short section of the treatise called Of Natural Abilities. Hume's subject there is the qualities that all moralists file under the title of moral virtues. Those qualities, he writes, are equally involuntary and necessary with the qualities of the judgment and imagination. His list runs constancy, fortitude, magnanimity, and in short, all the qualities which form the great man. And then this. The greater degree there is of these blamable qualities, the more vicious they become, and yet they are the less voluntary. Set that against your own moral arithmetic. You have been assuming blame rises with choice. Hume is saying that on the vices we hate most, the two run in opposite directions. The cruelty a man has to work himself up to is the milder article. And then Hume names where the demand for voluntariness came from. Legislators and divines and moralists, he says, have principally applied themselves to regulating these voluntary actions. They did it because they were endeavouring to produce additional motives for being virtuous in that particular. So the rule that blame must follow choice was never a discovery about morality. It was a working assumption held by the people whose job was to make you behave. Control is the only part of a person that an incentive can reach. The objection currently ahead on points is not the practical one. It says the phrase constitutive luck fails to mean anything. Rescher's argument is 2 lines long. You can be lucky about something only if it could have turned out otherwise for you. On Rescher's view, a differently constituted person is simply someone else. So identity precedes luck, and there is nothing here for unfairness to be about. Two rescues stood in the literature, and Samuel Kahn removed both in 2025. Hartmann had kept moral luck by defining it as lack of control rather than chance. Kahn's reply is textual. Williams and Nagel both treat it as a species of luck, which is what generates the paradox Hartmann wants. Lattes had kept the chance by changing the comparison class, asking how common your constitution is. Kahn's reply is that rarity sits perfectly well with desert, so rarity cannot be what makes constitutive luck unfair. If Rescher is right, this part has been describing a grievance with no owner. Nothing was taken from you because there was no you it could have been taken from. Kahn is careful about what he has done. He has not shown that constitutive luck is incoherent. He says only that in his view the prospects are dim. He also hands the other side its best route back. The essential and the non-essential in a person are extremely hard to tell apart. Most of the traits we actually blame fall on the non-essential side, where chance is available again. The aggressive version of the pressure is Neil Levy's, who adds luck in the moment to luck in the character and leaves responsibility nowhere to stand. The cleanest thing left standing is Matthew Talbot's, and it stops asking for fairness. Blame is protest. A woman wronged by a man raised to hold her worthless may protest her victimization, and that protest is itself a form of moral blame. Her standing to make it does not wait on whether he was reachable. Which returns us to the field and to the exit that was announced. The craftsman who stepped out gave a reason about his trade, not about the killing. What let him refuse was a business arrangement made years earlier before the question existed. The exit was open to every man in that field and affordable to almost none of them. Whether the word luck survives, Rescher is a question this video has to come back to. It does not rescue you either way. There is one more thing you were handed and are using at this moment in this decade on live questions, what you are currently able to see as wrong. Part 8. The things you are wrong about. Right now, you are not really worried about whether you would have kept slaves. That question is safe because it is closed, and you already know your answer. The worry that actually wakes you runs the other direction. There is something you are doing this year that everyone around you is doing, which your grandchildren will find unspeakable. You cannot currently see it. If you could see it, you would probably stop. That is the whole trouble. Earlier, the problem was whether anybody would ever ask you, and being unasked earned you nothing. Now the same problem moves one step inward. Even when the test arrives, you have to be able to recognize it as a test. Whether the wrong was visible from where you stood is not up to you either. Gideon Rosen states the principle that turns this into an excuse, and it is hard to reject. It is unfair to blame someone for doing something if he blamelessly believes that there is no compelling moral reason not to do it. Take that slowly, because you already accept it in ordinary cases. A man who hands a stranger water containing an odourless poison he had no way to detect is not a poisoner. Rosen's claim is that moral ignorance works the same way. If an ancient slaveholder blamelessly believed there was nothing wrong in what he did, blaming him is unfair in that same sense. but an excuse has to survive being asked why it excuses. So push on the ignorance itself. Surely a person can be to blame for not knowing. Here is the chain, one link at a time. You are to blame for an act only if you believed it was wrong, or you are to blame for your ignorance. But you cannot believe things at will. Nobody talks himself into a conviction by deciding to hold it. So your ignorance can only be culpable by way of something you earlier did, some inquiry you dropped, some question you refused. Now ask the same thing about that earlier act. Did you know it was wrong to drop the inquiry? If not, the question repeats. You have not lived infinitely long, so the series of earlier choices runs out, and a chain of borrowed blame with nothing at the far end has nothing to borrow from. The chain has to stop, and there is only one place it can stop. It stops at an act you performed, knowing full well at the time that it was wrong. Clear-eyed, wide-awake wrongdoing, with no story attached. Michael Zimmerman follows this to the end and does not flinch. Culpability for such ignorance, he writes, is rare, while our common practice treats it as frequently incurred. He believes the practice is misguided. Zimmerman says the thing we blame for hardly ever happens. Rosen says something worse. Even where it happens, nobody can ever tell from outside. Minds are opaque, other people's and your own. So we hardly ever know whether anybody is blameworthy for anything. Blame does not become false on this view. It becomes a verdict nobody is in a position to deliver. Michelle Moody Adams takes this apart, and her first move is to ask what kind of claim it is. The excuse rests on a thesis about inability, that growing up inside a culture can render a person unable to know that certain actions are wrong. That is a hypothesis about human minds, and a hypothesis about minds needs evidence. Her charge is that its defenders base claims about what agents could not do solely on evidence of what those agents did not do. Nobody objected, therefore nobody could. That inference would be laughed out of any other empirical dispute. Then she goes to the record, and the record does not cooperate. Even in the politics, Aristotle stops to argue against unnamed opponents of slavery who denied that it was natural. Those opponents existed. We do not have their books, and Moody Adams borrows Finley's reason why. The literature that survives is principally the product of those who had reason to support the institution. The silence in the archive is not the silence of people who could not think it. It is the silence of people who did not get copied out. Her third move removes the excuse wholesale, and it is very simple. Merely by learning a language, every human being can form the negation of any statement. Slavery is just. Slavery is not just. You can build the second sentence the moment you can build the first, and so you can conceive your world arranged on other principles. That is why her account needs no elaborate theory of moral knowledge. The capacity to question a practice arrives free with grammar. What she puts in place of inability is affected ignorance, which is choosing not to know what one can and should know. Sometimes it is nothing more than refusing to consider whether a practice you take part in might be wrong. Her cases include the executive who demands the profits and insists on knowing nothing about the means. Another is the mother who asks no questions about her teenage son's expensive gifts. The commonest variety is aimed straight at you. It is the tendency to avoid acknowledging our own fallibility. All of that is still an argument about what somebody 300 years ago could conceive. There is no need to speculate. In 1688, in Germantown, 4 German Quakers wrote the case against slavery out, signed it, and submitted it inside their own religious institution. Their names are printed on the paper: Gerrit Hendricks, Derek op de Greff, Francis Daniel Pastorius, Abraham op den Greef. Their argument was not subtle. There is a saying that we shall do to all men lick as we will be done ourselves. It went to the monthly meeting, which is the local congregation sitting as a governing body, and it judged the matter too weighty to decide. It went to the quarterly meeting, the regional body above it. It was referred upward again, and no answering action appears after that. This was 175 years before emancipation. The paper was lost for about a century and surfaced badly deteriorated in a meeting house vault in March 2005. In 1942, somebody knocks on your door and you answer or you do not. In 1688, somebody knocked on the slaveholder's own front door, in writing, with signatures. The answer was to send it upstairs. The truth was available. It was inconvenient. So the excuse needs a condition, and Fitzpatrick supplies one that builds the luck in and then refuses to let it off. Ignorance is culpable on his account if the agent could reasonably have been expected to take measures that would have corrected it, given his capabilities and given the opportunities provided by the social context. That clause concedes everything about circumstance. Someone raised where nobody has written the objection down has fewer opportunities, and Fitzpatrick grants it. What he will not grant is the rest of it. The failure still counts when it runs through overconfidence, dismissiveness, incuriosity, or contempt. Elizabeth Harman goes further and takes the excuse away at its strongest. On her view, even blameless moral ignorance does not excuse, where the action itself shows how little the agent cared. Blame, on her account, tracks how much the agent cared, not what he managed to work out. And the false belief is not a screen standing in front of the will. It is often the will showing itself. What a person finds it easy to believe about whose suffering matters is already a fact about how much he cares. Turn that on your own year. The question is not whether you have noticed the wrong, because by hypothesis you have not. The question is what you are currently unable to look at. There is a candidate you already avoid. The animals killed for food in your country this year at a scale you have never once checked. Or the person who sewed the shirt you're wearing for a wage you have never looked up. You are not being told which of those your grandchildren will name. That is the point. Neither were the Quakers who watched the paper go upstairs. Every reason you have for not looking is what a Philadelphia friend could honestly have said as he voted to send that paper upward. Arperly points at Huckleberry Finn. Huck believes it is wrong to help Jim escape. He believes he is sinning and will be damned for it. He helps him anyway. Whatever is moving Huck down that river, it is not his moral belief, because his moral belief says stop. So moral belief and moral concern come apart, and they come apart in both directions. A person who cannot see that a practice is wrong may still be tracking it in how he behaves inside it, and a person who sees it perfectly may be tracking nothing at all. which means the audit you are about to run on yourself, the one asking what you currently believe, may be reading the wrong instrument. That is not answered by anything Moody Adams says, and she does not claim it is. What she settles is a narrower question about how harsh the verdict has to be. One bad exit is a rigorously moralistic model which emphasizes blame without the forgiveness that recognizes how hard it is to be moral. The other is a therapeutic model which allows forgiveness by doing away with blame. Her third position is the forgiving moralist. You are answerable and taking a critical stance toward what everyone you know believes is genuinely expensive. She refuses to trade either away. So the position stands, though not cleanly. Whether the truth was visible where you stood is itself circumstance, handed to you like everything else. And still, where the record survives, unavailable turns out to mean unwelcome. Notice what has been carrying all of this in every part since the second. One word. Two people are alike, except for luck. Luck cannot change what you deserve. Does it refer to anything at all? Part 9. Maybe nobody is talking about anything. The 1688 petition went upstairs, and nobody standing in the room below ever saw it. That was bad luck about where you happen to be standing. 8 parts have now run on that word, and not one of them has stopped to define it. A bird crosses the path of a bullet, and we say the man who fired was lucky. Every step of this has used the word as though its meaning were settled and shared. It is not. There are 3 accounts of luck in the philosophical literature, and you have been using one without choosing it. The first is probability. An event is lucky when it was improbable, which is why the word sits comfortably on a lottery ticket. The second is modal. An event is lucky when it could easily have gone otherwise, like the car that missed you by a hand's width. The third is control. An event is lucky when it was not up to you, and that is the one every argument here has used. In 2016, Stephen Hales published a paper in the journal Nous, whose title gives away the result: Why Every Theory of Luck is Wrong. His claim is not that one of the accounts needs repair. It is that all 3 are irreparably defective, and he names 3 whole classes of counterexample against them: lucky necessities, skillful luck, and diachronic luck. You do not have to open the paper to feel the trouble. One case each will do. Start with probability. Shuffle a deck and deal yourself 13 cards. That exact hand had odds of about 1 in 600 billion, and nobody at the table calls you lucky for holding it. Improbable, and not luck. Now the modal account, where luck is what could easily have gone otherwise. A man is born with a genetic disease fixed at conception, which could not have gone otherwise in any nearby version of his life. Everyone who knows him calls it terrible luck. And control. A goalkeeper reads the striker's hips and gets a hand to the penalty. She did not control which way he shot, and she could not repeat that save on demand. So the control account has to file it as luck. Nobody who watched her would. That is the account you have been using. The control analysis of luck is one of the 3 that fail. The deflationist move is to say that the principle borrows its content from the analysis, so no analysis means no principle. The people who deny moral luck are the people who most need the word to mean something exact. The other side is no better placed. Robert Hartman's In Defense of Moral Luck, the leading book-length case for it, declines to give a general account of luck at all. All it needs, Hartman says, is an account that picks out the luck that matters morally. Hales, reviewing the book, answers that helping yourself to that phrase assumes in advance which differences between two agents are the morally relevant ones, which is the thing under dispute. Michael Moore's version of the complaint is stranger, because it is a diagnosis rather than a doubt. He says that when we call an outcome lucky in moral talk, we rarely mean that nobody controlled it. We mean that what happened was far off some moral baseline of the normal. Freakish. You do not control the sunrise, and you have never once called it lucky. Take the case Moore uses. Two gunmen fire, same weapon, same distance, same intent, same steadiness of hand. One bullet arrives. The other meets a freak wind of hurricane force and goes wide. Now ask about the one who hit. He did not control the wind, and the wind is the entire difference between the two of them. On the control account, his success is luck. But nobody talks that way. His shot went where he aimed it, and calling him lucky misdescribes what he did. He was in control, in the ordinary sense of the phrase. Now set that beside the bird, which has been crossing the path of a bullet since early in this video. A bird intercepts one shot and not the other, and one of the two men kills, while the other does not. The two analyses do not disagree about any fact of that case. They disagree about the bird. On the control account, the bird and the hurricane are the same thing, since neither gunman commands either. On Moore's account, they are nothing alike. Birds over open ground are ordinary. A wind of hurricane force is a freak. If Moore is right, the set of premises that generated this whole problem was never inconsistent. One premise was about freakishness and the other about control, and they were never discussing the same property. There was no paradox to solve. The damage reaches the version of this you have already read. Short accounts of moral luck teach two sentences that are false. The first illustrates luck in outcomes with manslaughter set against killing in self-defense. That is a category mistake. Murder against manslaughter is a difference in what was going on in the man's head, and self-defense is a justification for what he did. Neither pair gives you two identical agents, separated only by how things turned out. The real legal contrast is murder against attempted murder, which is the pair this video has been running since the fourth part. The second sentence says Williams coined the term and then developed it together with Nagel. They wanted opposite things. Nagel found a paradox inside agency and asked you to face it. Williams wanted the ideal of a self-sufficient morality given up, and read the paradox as a symptom of clinging to it. If you came here having read the summary, that is what you got wrong. So here is what half a century of this leaves you holding. You have now seen one counterexample against each of the three accounts, and Hales reports three whole classes more. Every theory of luck in the literature is broken, and the control theory is one of the broken ones. Both sides may have spent 50 years arguing about blame with a word that picks out nothing. That is your exit, and it does not work. Delete the word. Say "not up to you" instead, and run the two cases the principle actually rests on. A woman steps on your toes because somebody pushed her, and your resentment drains away as you learn it. Two drivers, both entirely faultless, and a dog runs into the road in front of one of them. You do not blame that one more than the other, and you consulted no theory to decide it. Neither judgment needed an analysis of luck, and neither of them was hard. Nagel's own presentation never needed one either, and he said so. The condition of control, in his words, does not suggest itself merely as a generalization from certain clear cases. It seems correct in the further cases to which it is extended. That is what makes the erosion yours rather than a specialist's. It is not the absurd consequence of an oversimple theory. It is a natural consequence of the ordinary idea of moral assessment, which is the idea you were using this morning. Concede what should be conceded. Moore's freakishness condition can be perfectly true and still not displace control, sitting beside it as a second requirement. And the reply just given is a bet rather than a proof. Dana Nelkin adds a third worry, that Nagel's four kinds may not carve the problem where it actually divides. Hales takes away a vocabulary, Moore takes away a paradox, and neither of them takes away the pressure. But the pressure now stands with no theory of luck underneath it, which is a thinner footing than it had 8 parts ago. The subtraction does not stop at the outcome, or at the room you were standing in, or at the temperament you were handed. It keeps moving inward until it arrives at the bare act of will, the last thing you have left to call yours. What is at the bottom of that? Part 10. The extensionless point. The last part could not settle what luck is. This part does not need it settled. 2 cases do all the work, and no analysis is required to see them. The bird and the bullet, where what you were judged for turned on a swerve you never authored, and a decision you made this morning where the question is whether the replays of it would differ. Neither case needs a theory of anything, so follow the subtraction all the way down. First, why the subtraction is compulsory rather than optional. You have already seen the principle. Blame addresses somebody, not a happening. Nagel's premise, in his words, when we blame someone for his actions, we are not merely saying it is bad that they happened. We are judging him, saying he is bad, which is different from his being a bad thing. A hailstorm is a bad thing. It is not a bad person. Nagel states the cost of that rule in the same breath. Something in the ordinary idea of what someone does must explain how it can seem necessary to subtract from it anything that merely happens, even though the ultimate consequence of such subtraction is that nothing remains. 3 rungs of that subtraction are behind you, and 1 is left. Each retreat inward was forced by the last, and each was answered by a further kind of thing you did not pick. Nagel asks about the last rung directly. His question concerns the stripped-down acts of the will itself. How can one be responsible even for those if they are the product of antecedent circumstances outside of the will's control? Here is the test that makes the last rung visible. If determinism is true, everything you chose this morning followed from states of the world set long before you existed. You refused the order or you obeyed it, and either way, which one was fixed in advance. Which makes the morning look less like a person deciding and more like a recording being played. So try the other branch, which is where most people quietly hope the answer lives. Suppose the choice is genuinely undetermined. The rollback was built by Van Inwagen to test exactly that branch. God rewinds the universe to 1 second before your choice and lets it run again 1,000 times. Now the replays scatter. 600 refusals, 400 compliances, and nothing whatsoever to explain which of them you got. Notice what the objection does not say. It does not say the choice was random or uncaused or unmotivated. Melee grants that the decision is caused by your own reasons and presses a separate demand. He wants an explanation of the contrast, of why this rather than that, and no answer is on offer. Nagel closed both branches himself in the same essay. The absence of determinism is no more hospitable to the concept of agency than is its presence. Either way, the act is viewed externally as part of the course of events. That sentence is what makes this Nagel's point rather than the libertarians or the determinists. Both descriptions are of a happening, and a happening has no author. Neil Levy turned this into a pincer in a 2011 book called Hard Luck. He needs one premise, and it is the one you have accepted twice already in this video. No difference in desert can rest on a difference nobody controlled. Now take any act you think you deserve credit or blame for. Either it expressed your settled character, which you did not choose, or it did not express that character, in which case something other than your settled self did the work. Levy calls that present luck, luck at the moment of choosing. Those two options are exhaustive, and his conclusion is that determinism was never the operative variable. Notice what has gone wrong here, because it is not a shortage of uncaused items. Nagel's diagnosis is that the subtraction destroys the kind of thing judgment needs. The self which acts and is the object of moral judgment is threatened with dissolution. Its acts and impulses get absorbed into the class of events. An event can be deplored or celebrated, and blame slides off it. Nagel's own phrase for the end state is that it leaves us with no one to be. You have heard the phrase before, named once and left alone. Here it is with the bill attached. The area of genuine agency, and therefore of legitimate moral judgment, seems to shrink under this scrutiny to an extensionless point. That is not an objection to your principle. It is your principle, paid in full. You wanted luck not to count against people. The bill is that there is nobody left for anything to count for. Now the reply, and it is the position most reflective people already hold without a name for it. Start with what the rollback demanded. It demanded that desert requires the replays to have been able to differ. Nobody in a courtroom or a marriage has ever asked for that. What gets asked is whether the person could take in a reason and act on it. The compatibilist grades you on that capacity, whatever produced it. David Brink's 2021 version states the standard most carefully. A wrongful act is excusable when the agent lacked a fair opportunity to avoid wrongdoing. Fair opportunity has two parts. One is situational control, whether the circumstances left you a real option, as they do not under duress. The other is normative competence, which is itself two things. Knowing the act is prohibited and being able to conform your behaviour to that knowledge. The argument to come attacks the competence limb, not the situational one. Susan Wolfe named that limb normative competence. Brink is not being stingy with excuses. He treats responsibility and excuse as inversely related, and both as matters of degree. A deprived upbringing can excuse partially or fully through what he calls epistemic isolation. Powerful social pressure not to reason about consistency, and no exposure to views that challenge the wrongdoing. Luck about your situation and your character does real work inside his theory. It just works through capacity, in degrees, instead of cancelling everything at once. 3 things press on that bargain in rising order of force. The first is the obvious one. Whether you have a competent will at all was settled by genes and upbringing. Why should exercising uncontrolled capacities count as control? The second is sharper, because it runs on a case compatibilists accept. Mele describes a designer who builds a zygote atom by atom. She knows the physics, so she knows which choices that zygote will produce 30 years later. The man grows from it, reasons competently, weighs his options, and decides exactly what she designed him to decide. Every compatibilist condition is satisfied, and he still does not look free. If that causal history undermines responsibility, why does an ordinary deterministic one not do the same? The third cannot be argued away, because it has a patient attached to it. Brink and Wolfe both allow that luck about competence excuses partially. Then what stops the partial excuse going all the way down, given that the baseline was never chosen either? Here is the patient this argument owed you. Burns and Swerdlow published the case in Archives of Neurology. A man with a right orbitofrontal tumour was, in their words, unable to inhibit sexual urges despite preserved moral knowledge. The urges were paedophilic, the behavioural symptoms resolved following tumour resection. Read that against Brink's 2 limbs of competence, knowing and conforming. The knowledge was intact. The inhibition was destroyed by a growth on a timetable nobody chose and handed back by a surgeon. The tumour is a physical cause of degraded inhibition. So is the ordinary distribution of inhibitory capacity, which runs on brains nobody ordered and childhoods nobody picked. So Brink owes an answer to one question. What is the principal difference between a growth that reduces inhibition and a childhood that does? He stipulates a threshold, and no principle in his theory says where to put it. That looks decisive for the luck theorist, so here is the reply he has not answered. Bailey, reviewing Levy's book, points out that the whole argument assumes responsibility is contrastive. It assumes you must deserve different treatment for doing A rather than B. Why, exactly, could one not deserve differences in treatment for A-ing, without deserving them for A-ing rather than B-ing? If that assumption is optional, the pincer loses a jaw, and the same assumption is what powers the replays. Everything the rollback proves rests on the demand for a contrastive explanation. Whether that demand is legitimate is unsettled, and every argument in this part depends on it. Nagel himself refused to become a skeptic about any of it. We cannot simply take an external evaluative view of ourselves. Those acts remain ours, and we remain ourselves, despite the persuasiveness of the reasons that seem to argue us out of existence. He would not say whether determinism is a bigger version of the earlier lucks or a different obstacle, which is why the moral luck literature and the free will literature keep colliding. If the honest reading is that nobody deserves anything, then the last objection lands. It arrives in two forms, and they are almost always run together. The first is a prediction about people. Would a society told that nobody deserves anything start to cheat and coast? The second asks nothing about anybody else. It says that even if the argument is sound, you personally cannot live inside it. You cannot look at what you did last year and think of it as weather. Is either of those true, and are they true in the same way? Part 11. What happens if you stop believing you deserve anything? The prediction can be tested, and it has been, for years. Tell people free will is an illusion, and they cheat more. That result walked out of psychology and into the debate as a fact about what happens when desert goes. The other objection, the one about you on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, no experiment reaches. It waits until the end of this part. In 2023, Oliver Genschow and 6 colleagues published a meta-analysis of anti-free will manipulations. 145 experiments, 95 of them never published anywhere. The manipulation check was clean. The manipulations decreased belief in free will and increased belief in determinism. Then the second half of their finding, verbatim, we could not find evidence for downstream consequences. Jonathan Schooler co-authored that meta-analysis, and he co-authored the original cheating study. Take the limit of this honestly, because it is narrow. It does not show that giving up desert is harmless across a life or across a culture. It shows that the evidence for immediate behavioral damage is missing after 145 tries. That moves the burden onto whoever answers the luck argument by predicting the wreckage. The same instruments then did something stranger. They turned on the intuition the whole debate was built to explain. Nagel's drunk driver from earlier is the standard case, and Cushman built a punishment study on the same split. 2 men drink through a football afternoon, and both drive home. One hits a tree and pays a fine. One hits a child and goes to prison for years. Nagel's argument depends on your reaction to a pair like that being a datum. Something so obviously how we judge that denying it counts as revisionary. Marcus Neer and Edward Macquarie asked whether the datum survives being seen. Their design difference carries the entire result. In a between-subject study, each person reads one version only. One group is told the child died. Another group is told nothing happened. Nobody sees the pair, so the outcome is the only evidence anyone has about the agent. In a within-subject study, the 2 cases sit side by side. The participant can see for herself that only the outcome differs. Laves objects to that design before it runs. With both cases in view, what you collect may be an avowal about theory, not the commitment that shows up in resentment and in sentencing. Neer and Macquarie's mother bathes her 2-year-old son and goes to answer the phone. She comes back and he has drowned. Beside her is a second mother who did the same, and came back to a child exactly where she left him. Between subjects, outcome moved all 4 measures: wrongness, blame, permissibility, punishment. Side by side, their published finding is that the vast majority of people judge a lucky and an unlucky agent as equally blameworthy. Their actions come out equally wrong and equally permissible. Then the mediation, which shows how the outcome gets in. Told only that the boy drowned, participants raise their estimate of how likely the drowning was. That inflated probability raises how negligent they judge the mother to have been. Mediation shows the three moving together, not which one moves first. The blame could be dragging the probability up behind it. Either way, the death is not the thing being scored. A story about how careless she was is being assembled backwards out of what happened next. You are not blaming her for the outcome. You are blaming her for a carelessness you invented after you learned the outcome. The scale-up came from Kinnear and Scotchen. 10 pre-registered experiments, 2,043 participants. In their second scenario, side-by-side, agreement on recklessness reached 93%. The exception is punishment, and it will not go away. Even with both cases in front of them, the agreement on punishment broke down. Martin and Cushman call this a feature. They predicted and found that outcome sensitivity in punishment lessens when the agent's behavior could not be changed. Kaplan, Posner, and Cheney gave 112 practicing anesthesiologists 21 real cases of bad anesthetic outcomes. For each case they built a matched alternate, identical in every respect but one. A plausible outcome of the opposite severity was substituted. In 15 of the 21 pairs, ratings of the appropriateness of the care itself moved with the outcome. Swap a temporary injury for a permanent one, and appropriate care ratings fell by 31 percentage points. These were specialists reviewing case files inside their own field. What the outcome moved was their judgment of the care. The debiasing result belongs beside it, because it is the practical one. In Kinnear and Scotchen's experiments, having people entertain the other outcome erased the effect on probability, negligence, and blame. Punishment survived it. Then turn the bird around. Earlier, the bird flew into the path of the bullet and left one man an attempted murderer instead of a murderer. That bird spared the victim. Now put it on your side of the ledger. The near miss is a bird that spared you. Dillon and Tinsley's near miss managers from earlier are the case. Rated as highly as the ones whose decisions actually succeeded, and their record pushed the next choice toward the riskier option. So the bird does not only sort the guilty from the fortunate, it launders and it bills you later. None of that reaches the second objection. A cheating rate is not an answer to the sentence, "I could not live inside this." Offering one as the other is the trade that makes a listener stop believing a script. So take the objection at full pressure and take it in your own case. The view seems to require you to look at your own past the way you look at weather. To stop resenting the man who wronged you because he was assembled too. To stop taking credit for the one thing you built that you are actually proud of. It looks like dissociation with a bibliography. Take the debt first, because it limits everything the reply is allowed to claim. Nagel refuses the skeptical conclusion inside the essay that produces it, and that shows the pull of the objection, not an answer to it. The hard incompatibilists do not flinch. Caruso defends the luck pincer, accepts the skeptical conclusion, and does not go hunting for a way to keep the furniture. The comfortable middle about to be occupied here is a position somebody has to argue for, and this part has not argued for it. What replaces the moral record is not settled here. Here is what can actually be said back, and it is narrower than the objection. The feeling the objection says would be hollowed out was never running on desert in the first place. The argument takes away a scorecard, and the attachments were never entries on it. You can stop believing the man who wronged you deserved to become what he became, and still refuse to be in a room with him. Protection and repair outlive desert because neither of them was ever a payment for something earned. Then the self you did not choose, which Margaret Urban Walker treats as material rather than damage. Her name for it is impure agency, meaning agency entangled from the start with conditions it never selected. Moral luck looks like a catastrophe only against a conception of the person as a pure will, owning only what it chose. Drop that conception, and the unchosen self stops being the thing that disqualifies you and becomes the thing you work with. Responsibilities outrun control, and the work is answering for the parts you did not pick. Living with such a self is a practice rather than a defeat, and Walker's full case is where this ends. Which leaves the one leg that carries real weight. The lorry driver's response never waited for a verdict about fault. It arrived before anyone had scored him, and it stayed after he was cleared. That is why the subtraction cannot reach it. No verdict ever licensed the response, so no verdict can withdraw it. Take away every judgment about what he deserved, and the pull to go to that family himself is still there, with nothing removed underneath it. So the objection has the direction of dependence backwards. It assumes the attachments were resting on the moral record and would fall when it was taken. The driver is the counterexample because his response was never standing on that record at all. The feeling you were most afraid of losing is the one that never asked what anyone deserved. So the intuition is shakier than advertised, and in 145 short experiments nobody has produced the damage. But this principle does not stay in seminar rooms and vignettes about bathtubs. It is what people reach for when they say they earned what they have, and that sentence decides who gets what. And there is one thing a person concedes last of all, not the talent and not the luck, the trying. Does anybody deserve credit for that? Part 12. You did not earn your effort. Either. What it does there is decide who gets what. Turn the principle loose on distribution, and it goes straight for the one thing almost nobody will give up. You can concede a great deal and still keep that thing. Concede the talent. Concede that your temperament and your nerve were assembled by people you never chose, which is ground this argument has already taken. There is still the part you did yourself. You got up early, you went back over the draft when nobody was checking. John Rawls closes that door in one sentence in section 12 of A Theory of Justice. Even the willingness to make an effort, to try, and so to be deserving in the ordinary sense, is itself dependent upon happy family and social circumstances. Not the talent, the work ethic. Under that sentence sits an argument in 4 moves. First, you deserve an advantage only if you're responsible for the ground of it. Second, no one is responsible for their native talent, their family, their class, or the century they were born into, nor for the market happening to pay well for the particular talent they were handed. Third, so no one deserves the advantages that trace to any of that. Fourth, shares should not be fixed by what people do not deserve. The conclusion is that market shares lack the desert justification usually offered for them. The conclusion is negative. It removes one justification for existing shares and by itself selects nothing to put in its place. It does not say the shares should be equal, or that they should go to whoever has least. Rawls plugs that gap from behind a veil that hides which person you turn out to be. From there, you would permit an inequality only where it improves the position of the worst-off group. That licenses unequal shares without licensing desert for a single one of them. Rawls himself goes no further, which is why he is not a member of the position this part is about. The natural distribution, he writes, is neither just nor unjust, and what is just or unjust is how institutions deal with it. A later group of philosophers plugs it a different way, and that way is the one you have probably already reached for. None of this is confined to seminars, and the split it runs on has been measured. Alesina, Glaser and Sacerdote read the World Values Survey and found 60% of American respondents saying the poor are lazy. Among Europeans, it was 26%. 54% of Europeans say the poor are unlucky, against 30% of Americans. Raj Chetty and his colleagues came at the same question with tax records. The fraction of children earning more than their parents has fallen from about 90% for the 1940 birth cohort. For those born in the 1980s, it is 50%. And a child in the bottom fifth has a 4.4% chance of reaching the top fifth in Charlotte. In San Jose, the same chance is 12.9%. None of that shows that beliefs about luck cause welfare policy. It shows that the second premise is not a seminar premise. It is what the two halves of the rich world disagree about when they argue about welfare. The second premise also has a reply worth stating in full. Responsibility for having a talent is not the same as responsibility for what you do with it. A pianist did not choose her hands, and the 10,000 hours were still hers to spend or to waste. Rawls's sentence is aimed at exactly that move. The willingness to spend the hours came from a household that made effort look like something worth doing. So the reply narrows the argument without stopping it, because it relocates desert onto a disposition that was also handed to you. The raw conclusion has almost no constituency. What has a constituency is the repair, and it is the shape of nearly everyone's private compromise. Keep desert, subtract the luck. The name for it is luck egalitarianism, though it is a family of arguments rather than a school. Many of its supposed adherents reject the label. Gerald Cohen made the repair an aim outright to extinguish the influence of brute luck on distribution. Richard Arneson built his version around equality of opportunity for welfare. What gets equalized there is the chances people start from, not the holdings they end with. Both share one structural claim. An inequality that traces to what a person chose is permissible, and an inequality that traces to circumstances she never chose is not. Ronald Dworkin supplied the test that turns the aim into policy. Option luck, in his words, is a matter of how deliberate and calculated gambles turn out. Brute luck is how risks fall out that are not, in that sense, deliberate gambles. And the hard edge, again in his words, people should pay the price of the life they have decided to lead. The economists who tried to make the repair operational ran into a wall. In the equal opportunity literature Mark Fleurbe founded, people differ along two things, their circumstances and their effort. Two principles encode the intuition this whole argument has been tracking. Aversion to inequality due to differences in circumstance, which is the compensation principle. Neutrality toward inequality due to effort, which is the reward principle. To level the hard worker from the poor household with the hard worker from the rich one, you have to move money. The only pot it can come from is the gap between the hard worker and the coaster in the same house. That is the exact gap the reward principle says you must not touch. Gabriel Carroll states the trouble without decoration. A population will feature differences in both, so no one policy is optimal by both principles at once, and we must mediate between them. That is a standing tension, not a theorem, and not an impossibility result. The literature's own answer is fleur-base, which is to relax one principle and require it only in special cases. That is a decision about which of the two you sacrifice, and no schedule of taxes will make it for you. Two objections stand against the position that its defenders have not disposed of. Elizabeth Anderson's is about what the arrangement says out loud. If your claim on the rest of us rests on your not being at fault, then the ground of the claim is your inferiority. You make it in virtue of being worse off than others, rather than in virtue of being their equal. Her device is a set of letters from the State Equality Board, arriving with the check. To the stupid and untalented. Unfortunately, other people do not value what little you have to offer in the system of production. To the ugly and socially awkward. How sad that you are so repulsive to people around you that no one wants to be your friend or lifetime companion. Her question is whether a self-respecting citizen could fail to be insulted by such messages. And the letters need never be sent. The board cannot gather the information it needs without branding some of its citizens as inferior. Samuel Scheffler grants everything the defence asks for. Grant that choices are genuine. Grant compatibilism. And grant that determinism buys you nothing here. A talent for choosing wisely, Scheffler says, is just one human skill among others. The person who is good at choosing friends may be bad at choosing investments. And the theory cannot call unwise choices less genuine, because it needs people to bear the costs of foolish ones. So the skill that decides who ends up with what is itself distributed like every other skill, unequally and by nobody's arrangement. Choice cannot carry the weight the repair puts on it. You cannot subtract the luck from your record and bank the remainder as credit. It is Tuesday, you are at work, and you want to know what to do. Part 13. Stop asking whether you are good. You are standing in a room right now. There are people in it whose interests compete with yours. There is an arrangement above you that would prefer you did not make a fuss. And there is a set of facts about your own life that decides what you can currently afford to refuse. Your rent, your visa, your reputation with the 4 or 5 people whose good opinion you need. The fact that you have exactly one marketable skill. That is the whole of your moral situation. None of it is a verdict. The willingness to try was the last thing you owned, and that turned out to have been issued to you as well. So begin with what you appear to be losing. Nagel's subtraction, run to the end through results and circumstance and character, left an extensionless point. It is nothing with any size at all. Now read that a second time as arithmetic rather than as a tragedy. An extensionless point cannot be praised. It also cannot be humiliated, audited, or defended. The moral record you have been guarding was never in your possession, so losing it cost you nothing you had. Relief and exposure arrive together here because the thing that stops being yours to defend also stops being yours to hide behind. What is left when the record goes is a position, and a position has parameters that can be changed. The first parameter is who can reach you. Varese and Yaish already gave you the number that matters, and it was not a number about courage. Being asked is what separated the rescuers from their neighbours. Their reanalysis found something else, and that is the practical half. People already involved in resistance activity were more than twice as likely to be asked. The knock was not distributed at random. It travelled along the lines of who was already standing near the problem. That turns the knock from weather into a design decision. You cannot make somebody knock. You can decide this year how many people have your address. Take that literally, and then take it as it was meant. Your innocence is a fact about your address, and not a fact about you. The second parameter is price. Back to the field outside Josefov on the 13th of July 1942, one last time. A man stepped forward and 10 or 12 followed him. You already know the reason one of them gave for being able to. He was no career policeman, and his living did not depend on the force. The man who stepped out of the line was not braver than the men beside him. He had a trade at home, so it did not matter that his police career would suffer. He had arranged years earlier, for reasons with nothing whatever to do with morality, to be able to afford a refusal. That is the only part of any of this that is under construction. And it is under construction right now, today, by decisions you are not filing under ethics. What predicted his refusal was not a belief. It was a balance sheet. 4 items sit on it, and not one of them looks like ethics. Savings deep enough to cover the months after a resignation. A second skill that would still feed you if this industry stopped returning your calls. A friend close enough to bring you the ask instead of leaving you unasked. And the absence of anyone whose good opinion you cannot afford to lose. A person you cannot afford to disappoint is a person who owns your answer. Those 4 set the price of a refusal, and price is the only variable anyone has measured that predicts whether refusals happen. Now the question that turns an inventory into a decision. Of those 4 prices, which ones did you set? Some were set for you by where you were born and which industry happened to hire you at 23. Some you set yourself last year and called it a career move. The inherited ones are not your fault and are not going anywhere. The ones you set are the whole working surface of this argument. There is a 5th item, and it is the ugliest one. What are you currently unable to afford to notice? Affected ignorance is not a failure of intelligence. It is a cost calculation nobody writes down. The Philadelphia friends who sent that paper upstairs could not afford to read it, and the reason sat in their ledgers rather than their minds. So, price a true belief. The practice you would have to leave, or the people at your table who would stop inviting you. Whatever sits at the top of that list is where the blind spot is, and it is no coincidence you have not looked. Exposure is half of the replacement. The other half is what you do when something happens where you are standing. Suppose the 4 are all in place. You have the savings, the second skill, the friend who can still reach you, and nobody whose approval you cannot afford to lose. Then something goes wrong in the room, and it was not your doing. Everything you engineered tells you what you can afford. It tells you nothing about what you owe once the damage is already on the floor. That is the case Wolf was trying to find a name for. Her nameless virtue is a willingness to answer for what happens where you stand, taking the scope of what you do widely rather than narrowly. It is the virtue that pays for the broken vase when the fault was never established. Walker supplies the reason this is not a consolation prize. The control principle describes a pure agent, one whose accountability stops precisely where its power stops. A world of such agents would be missing the virtues that matter most. Pure agents, in her words, may not be depended on, much less morally required, to assume a share of the work. The work she means is caring, healing, restoring, and cleaning up. A being answerable for exactly what it controls is a being nobody can count on. One question stays open here, and it is open in the literature too. Suppose you do all of it. You build the savings, keep the second skill current, stay reachable, stop needing that colleague's approval. Is that virtue? Or is it just a better managed kind of luck, the craftsman's good fortune arranged on purpose instead of by accident? Nobody has settled that, and it does not much matter to the man standing in the room. He has to answer for what happens there either way. Now, 3 things that should stop this feeling finished. The first is Wolf's own guardrail. So the circle goes wider than your will. How much wider, nobody knows, and no formula is coming. Her own limit is that taking more responsibility for harms further from your control does not make you better. An expansive scope with no limit is another way of never being answerable for anything in particular. The second objection goes under the whole thing rather than at it. And notice which objection it is not. The practical one, that nobody could actually live inside this, lost its evidence earlier. The conceptual one is untouched. Everything built here runs on one word, and the word may not name anything. Moore, Rescher and Hales each had the flaw earlier, and none of them was answered. Between them they take away the paradox, the bottom rung, and the analysis of luck this argument stands on. There is a reply, and it has to be made in the open rather than assumed. The pressure survives restatement without the word. You need no theory of luck to feel the bird that crossed one of the 2 bullets. Not up to you does the work by itself. That reply is a bet that the pressure outlives the vocabulary, and a bet is not a proof. If Rescher is right, one of the flaws in this building was never there. The third limit is the one you will reach for, so close it now. None of this is permission. Moody Adams gives the shape, full responsibility held together with an honest account of how hard it is to take a critical stance toward your own culture. She calls it the forgiving moralist, and the forgiveness is not an exemption. Adams said the same about the officer raised from childhood in the Hitler Jugend. Being a victim of your education gives you a particular claim to mercy, and no exemption from blame. You do not get to be excused. You get to stop pretending the excuse was ever the question. Which puts this where Williams was actually standing. He did not want the luck-immune morality repaired. He wanted it given up. His question was what the category is supposed to deliver. In his own words, he cannot see what comfort it gives him to be shunned, hated, unloved, and despised, not least by himself, and then told that these reactions are not moral. The answer here is not that morality survives that question. It is that you were never the sort of thing a verdict could protect. Which leaves the sentence to keep. The reason you have never done anything terrible may be that nothing terrible has yet been convenient. You stop auditing a past that is closed and start auditing a position you are still standing in. So do one thing this week. Take the 4 items and work out, in actual numbers, what your next refusal would cost you. Then start making it cost less.